All right, in the previous lecture, we described CheckoutJS as two X components and that the button iframe was sort of a middleman between the two. So now we're going to prove it by doing a deep dive using Chrome DevTools and stepping through the entire checkout process. All right, so using what we learned in the previous sections, let's see if we can dissect these X components in DevTools. So you should follow along as I set breakpoints and explain. If you fall behind, just pause the video to catch up. So we are going to open the miscellaneous deep dive file in our training application. All right, so under miscellaneous, deep dive. All right. So the very first thing I'm going to do is to one-touch authenticate because it's going to be easier for us to go through this deep dive using the lightbox flow. So if you haven't done it, go ahead and click the button and log in with your buyer account. And make sure you click stay logged in so you don't time out. So after I'm logged in, I'm just going to close it and make sure that I now get the lightbox, which I do. All right. So now we're going to open the sources tab and we're going to find the simple.html that we're on. This is the page with the JavaScript integration. So I'm going to set a breakpoint in payment and unauthorized because those are the two main callback functions during the payment flow. All right, so now let's take a look at the actual iframe that's being rendered. So you'll notice in the sources tab, this X component PP button. So this is actually the iframe that this render function creates. And you'll notice it is PP button, and that's what it's kind of called in the console logs as well. I'll see some X component right there, XCPP button. All right. So now we're going to look at the actual HTML page of the iframe that is rendering this button. So if we expand into the iframe, under Sandbox, Hermes, you'll see a button. And I'm going to open that. So this is the actual HTML that is rendered on this iframe. So we can take a look at it. This is some CSS, so it's not really doing much here. And then we have some HTML. We have some JavaScript here, which are all functions. And then we see at the bottom there's some script includes. So let's take a look and see what those are. So button. So we notice this is the button.js, which looks like it might be helpful, but it's in the actual compiled code. So instead we're going to go under Webpack, and it's actually under XO button.js and then index. So here you'll see the actual source code. So this looks interesting. These are all functions, so nothing's actually happening right here. And then at the very bottom you'll see this setup function being called. All right, so what does the setup function do? So you'll see its code, it's called as, in the actual global space here, it's not in an actual function. So this is called when the actual iframe renders, whenever this script is included. So it runs automatically. So you'll see that it's doing detect lightbox eligibility, determine locale. Here it's actually calling window.xprops, which is the onRemembered callback for the button component. So that's one undocumented callback. And then you'll see we're getting the button in the DOM, and then we're adding the click event listener. So this is where we're actually adding the onClick event. And then we're calling render checkout. So we'll go over that next. But then also notice down here is where we're calling the X component callback for onClick. So that's where we're sending that, we're executing the merchant's onClick callback. And this is typically where they would put their click tracking. All right, so render checkout looks to be the important function here. So let's go take a look at that. So if we see render checkout, it can take a payment token, and we'll go over that in the next portion. But then right away here, we'll see that it is doing checkout.render_to. All right, so this is actually rendering the checkout X component. So the checkout X component is the second X component that actually loads Hermes. And like I said before, it's actually triggered by the button iframe. So we can see it right here. All right, so now just going through the properties for the checkout component, you'll see it has a lot of the similar props as the button. So it also has a payment prop that we are just passing whatever the merchant passes into the button X prop is now getting passed into the checkout one via window.xprops, unless payment token is set. So that's a special case. And then we'll see we're just passing through locale commit on error. And then we'll see unauthorized. This is our second important callback event here. So you'll see here that it's actually receiving data and actions. So we don't know what they are yet, but it's looking to supposedly be receiving something. And then it goes through and it calls window xprops unauthorized, which is actually the button components unauthorized, and it sends whatever it receives for data. And then it also calls this get actions function. So I'm going to set a breakpoint first off just right in this render checkout function. So we want to see what's going on here. And then I also want to set one in the unauthorized callback so we can pause here and take a look around. Then you'll notice when we call unauthorized on the button component, we're also calling this get actions, where we're sending it the data and the actions that we got. So let's go take a look at that function quick. All right, so we'll see the get actions just goes through and starts creating some actual actions. We'll see here that we have the restart flow. So what's restart flow do? Restart flow closes the checkout experience, then enables lightbox, and then calls that render checkout function that we just went over with the data payment token. So that means that we're basically just restarting the experience, but we're using the same token that we got before. So this is how we do like the 104.86 error recovery. We call this restart flow function. And then you'll see some things that look really familiar. So you'll see actions is actually has a payment object that has an execute function. Well, that's the actual execute function that we executed unauthorized, like we did in the, like we do in the unauthorized function. So I'm going to go ahead and put one breakpoint here in the getActions function. And then since we're going to be calling the execute function, I also want to put a breakpoint in here to stop it when this function executes. Then you see they're just returning actions. So actions is going to be just this object that has, here you'll see restart, and then you got your payment get, payment execute and confirm, execute. So those are the actions that we saw on the unauthorized callback. All right. And that should be all the breakpoints that I need to set to view the entire flow. All right, so now we are going to go ahead and click the button. And where do you think we will stop first? I'll give you a second to think about it. So when I click this button, the very first breakpoint that we'll hit will actually be in the render checkout function. We should stop here on 209. So I click it and we see that we stopped on 209. We see that payment token is undefined. There's no payment token passed. All right. So then I'm going to, if I hit play here, where do you think we will stop next? Well, when I hit play here, it should continue going, but we'll see the window xprops payment. So that's the payment callback on the actual button component. So we should actually switch back over into the simple HTML into the payment callback. Which we did. All right, so we'll see that the we're calling PayPal REST payment create, and we're returning it, which is returning that promise. So now what do you think is going to happen when I click resume again? I'll give you a second to think about it. All right, so we should see the PayPal loading, and it should load PayPal. If you actually got a pop-up here, I suggest that you close it down and actually should authenticate, then close it down and reopen it so you actually get the lightbox experience. All right, so now if we look in our sources tab, we're going to see a brand new iframe here. If we hover over it, we see the entire screen is blue, so it's kind of showing us where that iframe exists, and it's the whole screen. That's because this iframe contains the overlay and the lightbox right here, the modal. And this is actually Hermes. So this is the iframe that the checkout component rendered. So if we looked in here, we would actually see the source code for Hermes checkout. And I'm not going to go through it all, but you'll see that it's actually the checkout now landing page, sandbox.com/PayPal now, and I could look and see what exactly that landing page has code-wise. And then if I wanted to get more information, I could go into any of the JavaScript files that I wanted to. And it also has some Webpack stuff here that we could look around in the actual source. But we're not going to go through that for this training. It's just for you to know that this is actually where the checkout component's iframe is rendering. All right, so what's going to happen when I click continue here? So I'll give you a second to think about it. So when I click continue here, Hermes is actually going to execute window.xprops.unauthorized and send that data and actions back to the button iframes unauthorized callback. So if I click continue here, we should stop here in the unauthorized callback of the checkout component, which is on the button iframe. And we can take a look and see what data that Hermes sent to us. Man, this is slow. We'll see that data is an object with this information. So you'll see that it has the payment ID, it has a payment token, and also the payer ID, which we'll need to complete the actual payment. And then we'll see that Hermes also sent us actions. So Hermes actually compiled the close and the redirect actions. So Hermes actually compiled redirect because it compiled the it used the cancel and return URLs directly in it. So that's why when we call like actions.redirect on the merchant site, it just knows how to get to cancel and return URLs. We don't actually have to specify them. So that's pretty cool. All right, so what is going to happen when I click play again? I'll give you a second to think about it. All right, so when I click play again, you're going to see that the checkout component, we're going to call the window xprops unauthorized which is actually the button components unauthorized. So we're actually going to go back to the button page. But before that, we're calling this get actions function, and we set a breakpoint there. So we should see the application stop in the get actions function. All right. So you'll see we stopped here in the get actions function. And you'll see that we passed in the data and the actions that we did get back from Hermes. All right, and then we're building that restart flow that we talked about. And we're building the actions, and then we're returning the actions at the end. So now what's going to happen when I click play again? I will give you a second to think about it. All right, we should return back to the merchants page on the unauthorized callback where we set a breakpoint. As you can see here, we're back on simple HTML and we are in the unauthorized callback. And guess what? We see data and actions. So data is the same data that we got back from Hermes in the checkout component, and actions is the result of that get actions function. So it's going to contain those compiled functions from Hermes, as well as the functions that that get actions function produced, which are, so we now have restart, redirect, payment. If we look in payment, we'll see we have execute, confirm, and get. So that's what we're doing here. We're doing actions payment.execute. So now when I hit play, where am I going to go? I'll give you a second to think about it. All right, when I click play, we're calling the execute function, and we placed a breakpoint there, so we should actually go back to the execute function. We're seeing the first thing it's doing is calling a close component, so that will start closing down the checkout component. And then we are executing the actual REST API call with the payment ID and the payer ID. And we're returning that. And that's where the actual request to execute the payment is coming from. And then you'll see there's a catch here. So if we actually receive an error on the execute, we are checking the message and saying if CC processor declined or instrument declined, we are going to call the restart flow. So that's how we are doing automatic recovery of the funding errors, is by just restarting the flow automatically here when they call execute. So this is going to pop up the light box again and ask the user to select a new funding source automatically. The merchant does not have to do anything. All right. So when I click resume here, we'll just see the API call actually being made, and then that is the end of our breakpoints and the end of our payment process. And we can actually see where we executed that execute on the server or on the network tab. If we looked in here, we would actually see the response of the API call. You could even look at the payload of the API call as well. We just send in the payer ID. All right, so that is a full deep dive of the CheckoutJS process. So that is it for this section. Now we will get into actual integration work and do some exercises integrating the CheckoutJS